Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask the Advocate Live. We are so glad you're here and spending your lunch with us today. Today, we're going to talk about all of your questions about dyslexia, the special education process, and we are hoping that while we're live today, that you will interact with us and write your comments, write in the comments the questions that you have about how to get through the special education system, what's appropriate education for dyslexia, all of those things. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are today. I am Melissa Minnick, and I have the pleasure of working with Lorraine Hightower. Lorraine Hightower is a certified dyslexia advocate and consultant. And what that means is that she works with families of students with dyslexia in a couple of different ways. First, she is an educational advocate, and she represents families in the school system and helps navigate them through the special education process and ensure that they get the services and supports they need. And recently, she's also added an educational side to her business where she is working to educate and empower parents, teach them what she does every day, and help them apply those skills to their own children so they can advocate more effectively. And she does this through her group coaching program as well. So it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Lorraine. Thank you so much for opening yourself up and answering the
Well, Melissa, I don't know if we're still live. It looks like you might have frozen, so I'm just going to pick up and take off from there. It's a joy to be here. Of course, I absolutely love what I do. My work is my passion, and it's just an honor to help parents who have kids with dyslexia and to figure out what should they do when they're dealing with issues, whether it's in the school system through eligibility or IEPs or what have you. So, and I just want to say, you didn't say this about yourself, but I'm delighted to have you on my team because you are a licensed teacher of over 20 years and you bring a unique perspective to the work that we do, and you help make us all even better. So thank you for coordinating this Lunch and Learn, or this Ask the Advocate Live. So I'm ready to start answering some questions.
Excellent. Okay. Well, like I said, guys, feel free to go ahead and comment and let us know that you are here. We'd love to know where you're from as well. One time, Lorraine and I had someone join us all the way from Malaysia, so that was really exciting. So if you could tell us where you are, that helps us, fit our answers better to your questions. Now we have. You know what, guys? Could you tell me too if you can hear me now? It looks like you can. Okay, because I heard I was frozen earlier. My apologies for technical difficulties. I'm glad I'm back. Great. Okay, so you guys can go ahead and ask your questions in the comments. And in the meantime, I'm also going to be asking some questions that were sent to us ahead of time. So, Lorraine, our first question is one that we hear a lot this time of year because many parents and children are dreading that testing season that comes in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And the parent who wrote to us shares that her child hates school. Mm-hmm. And the last thing that she wants to do is put her child through more testing right now. She wants to know how to refuse school testing. Do you have any advice for her?
Absolutely. I mean, any parent, of course, whether or not you have a child with a disability or your child is just a general education student, any parent can refuse testing. It's really quite simple. The parent just needs to, I always say, put everything in writing. So I would say write an email or a letter, whatever your style is, to the school principal and let them know that you are it's your parental request to refuse that testing, whether it's an SOL or what have you, a test at the beginning of the year for your child. Now, that said, for parents who have a child with disabilities, they always can opt their child out of testing, and they would notify the administration the same way. So they would simply, and you can even notify, I want to say, up until the morning of an assessment. Some parents feel like if they don't give weeks of notice, their child has to take the assessment, but you can notify up until right before the assessment. I don't think that's best practice. Of course, we want to give as much notice as we can, but certainly that is a right of every parent. The only caveat I would add, Melissa, is when we're talking, I know here in Virginia, many of the schools have already just administered the writing SOL or the writing standard of learning test to a lot of kids. You do want to consider the child's grade level when you as a parent are refusing testing or opting them out of testing, because once they get into high school, their performance on the statewide test becomes part of verified credits and graduation requirements. So that's kind of the only caveat that I would share. And of course, as we always say, if the child has appropriate accommodations, either through an individualized education program or a 504 plan, then hopefully they can take that assessment and do quite well on it, or at least show what they know on it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's I know that we have talked before about a lot of pros and cons to having your child take part in those assessments. Could you talk to us a little bit more about some of the benefits, especially from your point of view as an educational advocate? What are some benefits to taking the tests, as well as some cons?
Right. So, I just want to say, if it's not going to be socially and emotionally damaging to the child, because there are some kids who truly have test anxiety, or maybe they're very hyper aware of their disability, and it almost is re-emphasizing that if they're put in a testing environment. So let's just say your child is pretty, open to taking a test, and it's not going to be harmful to them. Then I think it can be a wonderful assessment tool for determining what are their present levels, what are their unique needs. Were they successful in reading the text that went along with that assessment? Did they perform okay compared to their peers? Or instead, did that assessment actually highlight some significant weaknesses, and potentially families that didn't know their child might have a specific learning disability are now kind of put on alert that this could actually be a red flag. Many of these tests also are very comprehensive in nature. And so once a child takes this test, even if they do, let's just say, well or average, you can look into all of the subcategories once you get the results back from the comprehensive test. And you can see, was there a pattern of underachievement? With kids who have dyslexia, we often see in math, for example, they might do well on applied math problem solving, but in word problems, they might miss every single word problem because they don't actually have a math thinking disability, but they do have a reading disability. And maybe they didn't understand the math vocabulary, or they didn't understand the sequence of those words, what it was asking them to do. So, that's just an example. But of course, the cons to me are the social and emotional impact on the child, the anxiety, highlighting the disability and not the ability. And then the pros are that it does give parents, standardized information about how their child is doing in key areas as related to their same age and same grade level peers. And it also, will tell you if they're learning or not, right? In Virginia, they just gave Virginia growth assessments to all kids, students with disabilities and without, to kind of see, what was the learning loss? How much content did they retain? So there can be benefits to these tests, even though I do feel like as a country, we over-test our kids. I have to say that, but I think there can be merit in it, right?
Right. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, guys, we added a Google Drive link for you to download a PDF of our pro-con list, because it really is such a personal decision. I mean, your children better than anybody else. And so take a look at that pro and con list, and you can make your choices from there. We've got a couple questions coming in through the chat. So thank you guys for participating. Yeah. Let me get to the first one here. It says, is an education law attorney a good recommendation for someone's child who has learning disabilities, and you are getting backlash on his issues? So if you're getting backlash on his issues, is it good to get an education law attorney involved?
So first, I want to share that I'm not a special education attorney. I am a advocate who's certified in the area of dyslexia. So I think that it does depend on what I'm going to call the dispute or the area of disagreement, and what is the parent hoping to accomplish, right? Absolutely. If you are looking, in my opinion, again, to file a due process claim against a school district, and perhaps you're seeking private school placement or something of that nature, you would be best served. Again, in my opinion, advocates in Virginia can file due process, but that's not something that I do. I believe a special education attorney is the accurate person and the most qualified person to take a family through due process, which actually can result in a hearing. And, they have specialized knowledge on how to help parents navigate that. On the other side, if you're having a dispute with the eligibility team, with the IEP team, introducing an attorney into those conversations can can elevate it to a level of egregiousness that maybe wasn't there before, because now you're bringing an attorney to the conversation. The school district is most likely going to want to bring their attorney. And now sometimes you get caught up in the legalities of things and you're way far away from what's in the best interest of the child. And that's where I feel that an advocate can actually be very helpful. And I know I've served in this role many different times in working collaboratively with the parent and the school team to resolve whatever the dispute is, if it's at the eligibility level or the IEP level, in meeting the unique needs of the child. So I hope that's helpful. And if the parent wants to ask a little bit more, I'll certainly try to give them a different answer if you're still looking for something more.
Okay. All right. The next question is, what do you do when a school will not release past IEP 504 and student records to the biological physical custodian or the mother?
Well, yes. So that would be puzzling to me that they're not releasing the records if you are the biological mother and you have physical and legal custody and you have educational decision-making rights for that child. You are entitled to a copy of their student records, their cumulative student file. Yeah, you might have to wait for that. Many school districts have a policy that you have to put in that you want a copy of the cumulative student file, and it may take 45 days for them to make that available to you. In some cases, they'll say you can come in and review it, but you can't, we're not going to make you a copy unless you pay extra, or you can come in and take pictures, but we can't release the whole, document. School districts can be challenging at times, but others are like, yes, here you go. And if parents aren't able to get that through a direct parental request, you certainly can use the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA. You can FOIA that information. There's also FERPA. You can Google FERPA, which I don't know if I'm going to get the acronym exactly right, but that is a Freedom of Education Information Act as well, that entitles parents to this information. I think the bigger question for me as an advocate is, why is the school district refusing to share this information with you as the parent? That would be a red flag for me in terms of, is there something that they're afraid to share? Like perhaps maybe they haven't been implementing the services, or they have no record of the services, or they haven't actually been conducting effective progress monitoring assessments. So they don't have any data to show that that's been happening. So I think, again, I always say, well, what are you trying to accomplish and asking for this information? And of course you're entitled to it, but is there another way that you could go about advocating for your child to get the desired outcome that you want, other than asking for all of that information? And again, we don't know that much about your child's situation, so it may or may not work for you in that context.
Lorraine, if they go directly to their school to ask for this information and they're given some pushback on that, who do they contact next? What's their next step?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, every school district has, somebody who serves in a special education supervisory role, or a director of special education, or assistant superintendents. Many districts have an office of procedural support or due process. So you could absolutely start there if you have a child with disabilities. But you could also, contact the information officer for the school. I mean, that would be another call. I'd probably make both at the same time and say, I'm trying to get a copy of my student information, and please let me know what the process is for requesting and receiving that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah.
And if that parent is here and you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to type those into the chat as well. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, we will go back to one of our other questions that was sent in to us. And this one touches my heart a little bit because she starts off by saying, I feel like I'm being bullied by my child's school. I want to have my child reevaluated, but they are telling me that if they test my child, they can take away his IEP. Is that true?
Oh, that is a popular question, I'm going to say, one that I'm asked quite frequently. So I understand. I mean, it is, of course, concerning that the parent feels like they're being bullied. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of, I heard you say it's a reevaluation. She's asking for reevaluation. The school team suggested or told her that if he or she does well on the reevaluation, they're going to take away the services. Is that right, Melissa?
That's right. And actually, she adds on to that to say, don't they have to retest them because the date is written on the IEP? So isn't it required?
Okay. So the first answer is it depends on the state that you live in, quite honestly. Okay. We live in Virginia. So I'm going to speak about Virginia as an example, but Virginia is a consent state. So in Virginia, even if a child goes through a reevaluation, and let's say they perform better than expected or average or above average in all category, which some kids can do once they've had a certain amount of remediation, or maybe they're gifted with a disability and they can actually perform better than expected, but they still have a disability. So even if that were to happen and the school district were to say, we're not seeing any evidence or impact of the disability anymore, and we would like to propose that we remove your child's IEP or whatever the case might be, the parent in Virginia has to provide consent, written consent, in agreement that they want that IEP removed. If the parent withholds consent and does not provide consent, then the school district technically cannot remove that child's individualized education program or IEP. So that is different. And I know California, I believe, is a consent state, and there's 2 others in the country. But in non-consent states, the reverse is true. So we have people from all over, Melissa. So I just want to say that if you believe your child is going to perform very well on a reevaluation and it is at risk of losing their special education services or supports, and you kind of don't want to go through that process and have that conversation, then in that case, you may not ask or pursue reevaluation. I will say there's quite a trend right now. It's a little bit concerning to me, but it seems like in a lot of school districts, if they don't suspect a change in disability, they are not putting kids through reevaluation. And that's concerning again to me as an advocate, because reevaluation isn't just for a change in disability. It's also to determine a child's educational needs. Right. So we have parents that we work with whose kids were identified in 1st and 2nd grade, and 3 years in their growth and development from a neurological perspective and a social and emotional perspective, that's a lot of years. So I would definitely want a reevaluation to see, what has changed, what are their educational needs now, and be able to use that information working with the IEP team.
Great. Thank you.
I think you said there was another piece to her question. I don't know that I answered everything.
Well, yeah, actually, I had a follow-up question myself, just that it's disheartening that she feels like she's being bullied. And so there must be a breakdown there. So I was wondering if you could share some advice as how to get a deteriorating relationship back on track again with the school team.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of like we were just saying earlier. There are others in the school district, other than the members of the school team and the IEP team, that parents should consider if they feel like they're being bullied, or the relationships are starting to fray, or the meetings are completely non-productive, or they don't feel like they have the right people in the meeting. Definitely, I would say the first action that I would suggest is to invite others to the conversation. If it's an IEP meeting, I would ask for a special education supervisor to be there, or I would ask for somebody from the Office of Procedural Support to attend. Again, in Virginia and many other states, the Department of Education has facilitators that are available to come to school meetings if the parent and the school agree that they actually, haven't had productive conversations, and they could use some help with an impartial facilitator to kind of make sure they stick to the agenda, that everyone is heard, and that they resolve issues. Hands down, I'm going to say that advocates like us serve an important role in this as well, and have definitely helped parents make sure that they are heard, make sure that the child's needs are addressed, make sure that we're using data to guide all of our decision making, and make sure that parents know their rights in terms of dispute resolution along the way. And as we said earlier, when to bring in an attorney and when we might be able to resolve things on our own. So it is, I don't want to make light of it. I think, unfortunately, these conversations can be hard. There can be a lot of emotions involved for both school personnel who feel like they're doing everything that they can for the child, and families who often feel like it's not working or you're not listening. And so I think the emotions often get in the way of productive meetings and conversations. But
that's actually what I was just thinking, Lorraine. I think that a real big benefit to bringing an advocate, a facilitator, or somebody else on board is it allows you to take some of the emotions out of it and come at it from more of an advocacy mindset, where you're approaching solutions instead of the emotions and the bad feelings that may have surfaced in the past.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more live questions here.
Okay. I'm sorry, Melissa, but can people tell us where they're from? I love to know where people are from.
There were some up at the top here. Let's see. We've got Elkton, Virginia, Fairfax, Any others here? I'd love to hear from where you're from. We just had
Go
a
ahead
couple
with the
people.
question. Yeah, I don't want to
Okay,
interrupt.
yeah.
It's fun when we find out people are from all over the country. So
I know, I do love that. Okay, so one of our questions is from Stacy, and she says, "Are there any COVID-funded services available to a kid who was just found eligible for an IEP with a SLD in second grade, first grade?" And Stacy's from Fairfax, so that's
okay.
helpful to know. So in second grade, first grade was virtual, and they refused testing at the end of first grade, stating that they wanted him in a classroom in person before sending him to testing. And here we are, 11 months later. She says that he is dyslexic, and he also has rapid processing concerns.
So I just was trying to make a note. They refused testing in first grade, and he's now in second grade. And she's wondering, are there any type of recovery services, right?
Yes.
Well, first, I just want to say for everyone who's listening, yes, absolutely. There are recovery services. In some states, they call them COVID-19 recovery services. In other states, they're calling them compensatory education. School districts were given, COVID-19 funds, American Rescue Act funds, all kinds of funds have been provided to school districts for not just special education students, but general education students as well. So just to know, yes, there is funding and additional resources out there to meet the unique needs of kids who have a significant gap in their learning. Now, the tricky part is they refused the testing in first grade. So he technically did not have any kind of an individualized education program. That said, I don't know all about Stacy's unique situation. If she wants to book a discovery call with me, we could talk a little bit more in-depthly, privately about it, because it's hard to know exactly what went into the decision to refuse the testing. But potentially, if there was an unnecessary delay and that has added to a wider gap, that would be one way to ask the school district to put in place some COVID-19 recovery, services right now. But if, let's just say the fact—
And Stacy responded yes to that.
Okay. So yeah, so that would be my concern, is if there was this unnecessary delay, because when we're talking about evaluation, it always concerns me when a parent says the school district refused the testing. Under the child find obligation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which kind of governs IEPs and individualized education programs, there really is no option to refuse the testing, quite honestly. Child find says that all school districts are supposed to locate, identify, and evaluate. It's actually in the regulations. Evaluate kids suspected of having disabilities. So, that's one piece of her situation, that didn't happen. And if she can show that going back to that date and time when she first asked for the evaluation, that he should have been found eligible, he wasn't found eligible, now we have this huge gap in learning, then absolutely, I would be talking with the IEP team about what do we need to do right now to close this gap as soon as possible. And do we have all the right services in place? And I would also be considering extended school year services, as well as COVID-19 recovery services that can be implemented over the summer. Now, when it comes to extended school year, I don't know when they implemented this young man's IEP, but they need some time to work with him under an IEP to make an ESY determination. So I'm kind of going off track, Melissa, but I just want to say—
I know there's so much here. There's so much to talk about with this.
But when we're talking ESY, extended school year services, this is very different than summer school. These are services to maintain a child's progress, like maintain them where they are so they don't slip over the summer. So when they come back in the fall, as their performance relates to their IEP goals, we haven't lost huge ground. So that's one consideration for students with disabilities. That said, COVID-19 recovery services can also be delivered over the summer if a child failed to make progress. And I think that's more of Stacy's situation. It sounds like delay in getting eligibility, delay in getting the IEP, the achievement gap for her child has widened. And so now what can the district do in terms of COVID-19 recovery services to close that gap as soon as possible?
And Stacy added that the school team had said that they didn't want him to be tested over the summer with strangers. Is that a valid reason for delay?
Not in my opinion, and not according to the regulations.
Yeah. So Stacy, I added our website down there. If you want to talk to Lorraine, you can go ahead and book a complimentary discovery call to get, more personalized information.
But I hope that was helpful in the interim.
Yeah, exactly. So we have another question about a 15-year-old Virginia high school sophomore who
Okay.
has never received dyslexia remediation with Fidelity.
Mm,
FCPS granted an IEE. The psychoeducational evaluation was completed. Results coming after the annual IEP next week. So she'll have that next week.
okay.
Sociocultural was done and SL first part done.
Hmm.
Unable to find OT AT evaluator.
Hmm.
School keeps asking the student to take Lit Essentials, which is unhelpful. Would like ESSER funds to be used for one-to-one tutoring and or an outside practitioner.
Hmm.
This student is encoding at a 5th grade level. Do you have any suggestions for this person?
Well, I will do my best. That's a
A
very
lot.
personalized question, and I typically like to have all that information in front of me before I give a very personalized answer. But what I took from that is that we have a high school student who has an IEP that the parent feels the district has failed to provide their specially designed instruction with Fidelity. So obviously there's a gap because they're decoding at 5th grade levels, what I heard you say, Melissa. So there's a significant
That's right.
multi-year gap.
Or
So
encoding at a 5th grade level.
yep. So this is problematic for sure. And it sounds like they got an IEE, which is probably going to speak to the multi-year gap and make some productive recommendations on what should have happened. Then I heard the parent say, can we get an outside provider? Can we use these funds to get an outside provider? So this sounds like a situation again, where if the student has been harmed and has not received what they should have, and it's led to the gap or hasn't closed the gap, this is a compensatory education discussion right here, in my opinion. So, this can happen with the IEP team. It doesn't have to involve an attorney. It could involve an attorney. But when you're talking about outside placement, that is typically a difficult conversation to have. And the reason I say that is because the school district is supposed to be given a fair opportunity to work with the child and do whatever they think is in the best interest of the child to close that gap. So I don't know what kind of evidence, for lack of a better word, this family or this school district has in this particular child situation to show, yes, we believe we have done these things with Fidelity, and the parents saying, no, absolutely not. I have proof that this never happened. So
Right.
depending upon that degree of, for lack of a better word, evidence, then you're having discussions around, well, what's appropriate compensatory service education, and is private placement appropriate or a private tutor appropriate? And it may be, but I don't have anything other than just hearing it. But I would say it's worth the conversation. Absolutely. If you have an IEP and you have services and they haven't been done with Fidelity, you are either a candidate, your child is, for COVID-19 recovery, or compensatory, and there is a difference. I just want to say, Melissa, because I don't want to create confusion, COVID-19 recovery in Virginia is a phrase or a term that they're using related to the pandemic. So what
Right.
that means is that it wasn't the school district's fault that we had a global worldwide pandemic and that schools were shut down and that people couldn't access the curriculum, couldn't access special education and make progress. So it is like a no harm type situation. School district is saying, we realize this happened. We're sorry. We couldn't do the services. So we're going to give that child COVID-19 recovery services to help close the gap and do what we couldn't do during the pandemic. Now, that is vastly different from compensatory education services where the school district had access to the child. In this case, they were providing the services, but maybe not with Fidelity. The child failed to make meaningful progress, so the multi-year gap grew. Now we're talking a child has been harmed by what the school district did or did not do and is now entitled potentially to compensatory education services. So,
and to help parents figure out whether or not compensatory education services are possible for their child, we created a flowchart that kind of walks you through that decision-making process. And I added a link to a website in the chat where you could go and download that flowchart and see if compensatory services might be right in your situation.
mm-hmm.
Hillary also adds Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
No, I
Lorraine.
was just going to say people loved that flow chart. That was very popular
Yeah,
when
it was a popular one, definitely, because especially after COVID, everyone is concerned about COVID-19 recovery
Mhm.
versus
Right.
compensatory and what they're eligible for.
Yep.
Hillary adds here that she says due process and eligibility said compensatory lasts only 2 years, and since COVID has been 2 years and it is no longer viable, recovery is still possible.
Yeah, I think what they're referring to there is that in due process cases and claims, there is a 2-year statute of limitation. I think that's what the
Okay,
office is referring to. And again, you can always confirm this with an attorney, but that is my understanding is that there is always a 2-year statute of limitations when you're talking about a due process claim. So I think that's what they're talking about. But absolutely, recovery services are still an option for that child.
great.
And then I think it becomes the question of who is best suited to provide the recovery services. If you have history and data to say that the school district hasn't helped your child to make meaningful progress, then the IEP team can consider, contracting an outside private practitioner if that's who needs potentially to do the work with your child to make meaningful progress.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah.
Our next question is back on the topic of evaluation. This question says, my child's school has refused my request for evaluation. What should I do next? Should we pursue private evaluation? If so, who do you recommend?
So we talked a
Sounds like
little
a
bit.
local friend.
What's that?
It sounds like a local person where she's asking who would you recommend?
Oh, for an evaluation?
Yeah, for the evaluation.
Well, let me start there because that's
Okay.
super. I'm not going to give out names because I don't like to do that. But I will say that we definitely recommend licensed clinical psychologist or neuropsychologist or even some speech language pathologists are licensed to diagnose dyslexia and other specific learning disabilities. So that would be who I would be looking for. And if that person wants a very specific recommendation, if they want to schedule some time to speak with me and I know more about their child, then I could probably guide them with a more personal recommendation. But in this forum, I don't really want to say, because we don't know who we're talking about. What's the child's
Right.
situation? Who would be appropriate? But you're
Yep.
looking for licensed clinical psychologists or neuropsychs and speech language pathologists. Okay, so go back to that question. They refused the evaluation.
Yeah.
I
So
feel
her
like,
school team refused evaluation. What does she do next?
so I
Should she
feel
get
like,
private?
yeah, well, certainly parents can get a private evaluation. I think the timing of that private evaluation is something for parents to think about because, as I said earlier, under the child find obligation, schools really should not be refusing to evaluate a child. And I hear this all the time. I mean, it's just, unfortunately, it's way too frequent. And so I think parents should know that there are procedural safeguards that are in place for them if the district refuses to evaluate. There are not due process, dispute resolution steps that they can take. Everything from elevating the conversation within their school district to say the school team refused to evaluate. My understanding is that under child find, the district is supposed to evaluate. Can you help me understand more about that decision? To actually formal dispute resolution, like filing a state complaint, requesting mediation, working with an attorney to file due process, which I don't think is necessary when we're talking about an evaluation, because again, a school district has an obligation to find and evaluate students who are suspected of having a disability. And the only way you know for sure if a student is someone with a disability is to conduct an evaluation. So that said, I don't understand the refusal piece, but we've addressed it, right? So if that happens, then yes, of course, any parent can go out at any time and get a private evaluation. What I tend to recommend to our families that work with us is, let's have the school district first conduct their evaluation. And then if for any reason you disagree with the findings of that evaluation, you as parents, one of your procedural safeguards is to request an independent educational evaluation or an IEE. And that then entitles the parent to a private evaluation. So anytime the school district conducts an evaluation, if the parent disagrees with the finding, they can ask for a private evaluation that is paid for by the school district. And many parents don't know that that option exists for them. The only, again, caveat that I would say to using the procedural safeguard of an independent educational evaluation is to know that if the school district is paying for that evaluation, they are entitled to a copy of that entire report. And in some states and districts, they get that information before the parents do. So in situations where parents are concerned about what testing is going to show, I have worked with parents who say, I just want to go and get my private evaluation for my own peace of mind. I want to know what my child's strengths and weaknesses are before I even decide if I want to ask the school district for eligibility. So in those cases, a private evaluation is warranted first. And that's why we say everybody's situation is different. And so we try to tailor our advocacy recommendations to what the family is trying to accomplish. What are we trying to achieve? And we always say that we believe parents are the number one best advocates for kids. We just want to help you make the right decisions so you can get the right outcome for your child along the way.
All right, thank you, Lorraine. If the school has found the child eligible for an IEP for SLD, but he hasn't been diagnosed, do you recommend going through private testing? Sorry, it moved. I lost my track there. Do you recommend going through private testing to get a medical diagnosis in addition to the school evaluations that were done?
Yeah, I think that's another excellent question. And I will say, more often than not, my answer is going to be yes. It does depend upon the school district, and it does depend upon how informed they are about the unique needs of students who have the specific learning disability of dyslexia. Because a school district's test is not going to diagnose dyslexia, but it may have all the indicators that this child has dyslexia, even though we don't have a formal diagnosis. And the school team may actually be well informed enough to know that when they propose the IEP, they're proposing all the appropriate goals, they're proposing the appropriate intervention, and the family is delighted with that. So they don't have any reason to seek out a formal diagnosis. Now, of course, the reverse is more common than I'd like to see happen with school teams. So they might get an evaluation that indicates specific learning disability of dyslexia. And because they don't have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, they will make the decision that we can actually really use any literacy curriculum. We can put the child in any specialized reading program. And we know that if it's not evidence-based to be effective for a student with dyslexia, they're not going to make meaningful progress towards their goals. So in that case, absolutely yes. And as I said, more often than not, I am encouraging families to get that private evaluation under an IEE so that we can get that diagnosis and confirm for the school district, your intervention must be evidence-based to be effective for this child who has dyslexia, because we now have confirmed that with a clinical diagnosis.
Great. Thank you. And the parent says thank you as well. Thank you very much. So another parent has a question. She says, if Wilson is offered as a pullout service and it's agreed upon, but the school then will not write it directly into the IEP, just a general broad description of the program for pullout, is the school held liable if it's for implementing it with Fidelity?
So these are great questions. I love our community. I love being in the company of smart, informed, engaged parents. So thank you guys for spending your lunchtime with us. So I heard that they've got Wilson pullout happening for this child. The district is not including the program name in the IEP. And then I didn't hear the last part exactly, Melissa, or I need to be reminded of what it was.
Sure. So if all that's written into the IEP is a general broad description of the program for pullout. So is the school held liable for implementing it with Fidelity then?
Right. So most schools absolutely will not include program names. And I think, to be fair to the schools, they're not necessarily doing this to be difficult. They're doing this because the IEP travels across the country, travels from grade to grade, travels, to different schools in the district. And we know that not one program meets the needs of students with dyslexia. Now, that said, we are also looking for in my opinion, an Orton-Gillingham approach to literacy, because that is evidence-based to be effective in meeting the needs of kids who have dyslexia. Wilson is one of those programs that uses an Orton-Gillingham approach. So to me, if I were the parent, I wouldn't be so concerned with, are they using the term Wilson, but I would be concerned with a general description of the intervention. I would want a very detailed description of the intervention that says we are using a multi-sensory, explicit, phonologically and orthographically based specialized reading and literacy intervention that is cumulative, sequential, multi-sensory, and it requires mastery at every level. That kind of language can be in an IEP. So,
and then that can be easily followed as they take that IEP from place to place.
yeah. And, just a note about Wilson, because I often talk to parents who say, how do you feel about Wilson in the school districts? And, some school districts use the Wilson intensive reading system, and that is usually what is required for a profound and severe dyslexic student. What is very concerning to me is when they're using a Wilson intervention like Just Words, which is not what Wilson language recommends for a severe and profoundly dyslexic student. So I think too, when I hear Wilson, it does beg the question of, in addition to that very detailed description, I would, if I were the parent, want to know more about which Wilson system are you using, and what is the scope and sequence, and how are you progress monitoring that, because it may or may not be the right Wilson program.
Good point. Thank you. Very good.
Yeah.
Another question is, can you decode and still have a dyslexic profile?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and not one we hear very often, Melissa.
No. Right.
But I will say yes, absolutely. Dyslexia impacts everybody, children and adults, kind of in different severities. So it can be mild, moderate, extremely severe. It's a spectrum, right? Impact. And it might impact reading. It might impact spelling. It might impact writing. It can impact everything. It can impact math calculation. There's even the term out there called stealth dyslexia, which is often associated with kids who can decode and they can read, but their dyslexia really impacts them on the visual letter representation, which is more orthographic impact. So they have problems with spelling or writing, fluently and knowing how to write the letters. But those kids can actually kind of fly under the radar because they're able to read and they look like they couldn't have dyslexia. They're decoding. And then I see kids who decode beautifully in isolation, but they can't transfer that skill with automaticity into everyday reading. Like once they're focused so much on reading with automaticity, now they're not comprehending. So absolutely, you can have very different profiles and still have dyslexia, and you may have mild, moderate, or severe. So I hope that is helpful to that parent.
Yes, definitely. And that made me think of twice exceptional children as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, and that's also a term that many parents aren't familiar with. But when Melissa's talking about twice exceptional students, these are some of the toughest kids to advocate for, because a twice exceptional or a 2E child has many gifted abilities, but then they also can have severe and profound disabilities. And that is a very puzzling profile for a school district. Twice exceptional kids are often missed for eligibility. They often don't have IEPs until they're in upper middle school, sometimes even high school, where they just can't compensate anymore and hide their weak reading and spelling. So yeah, I think is that what you wanted me to say, Melissa? Or do you want me to talk about twice exceptional?
I just want to make sure that parents know about it. It's a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing. And I will say those kids, if you have a child, well, what I will say for the audience here is if your child has very strong oral vocabulary and they're able to use these very high level oral language words, but then you look at their spelling and they're spelling way multi-years below their oral language, that is a huge red flag that you might have a twice exceptional student, because it says that part of their language center is very advanced, but another part of their language processing is behind.
Great, thank you. So as a follow-up to that conversation we were having about the Wilson program, what program would be recommended for a 15-year-old high school sophomore with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, reading at or above grade level?
Well, again, there's a whole bunch of programs. We would have to work with a school district to see what is available, right? And I would want to definitely know more about, are these gaps the same across the board, or is that students decoding stronger than their encoding? But There you can have just, some school districts are just using their own, I hate to say this, but it's kind of their own Orton Gillingham program, but they're following the Orton Gillingham scope and sequence, and they are using multisensory methods. So that's fine if it's working for the student. Other school districts are using packaged programs like, Wilson and like Singerland and like Spire and some of these others. We've seen kids make tremendous progress. So it really comes down to, what does the school district have available? What are they proposing? And then, as an advocate, I dive deep into these conversations with IEP teams, and I want to see, what does the placement test show? And what is the scope and sequence? And what is the child's baseline? And how big is the gap? And what's the pacing of the intervention? How many kids are going to be in the group? And who's teaching it? And what are their qualifications? So there's so many variables that when I work with families, we listen to all of this and decide, is this appropriate or not?
More about the approach than the program, it sounds like.
Yeah, because you can actually have a great program and have a teacher who has no idea how to implement it. Sure. And it's not really the teacher's fault in all cases. Maybe they haven't been trained. Maybe they've been quickly trained, but they've never taken a child through a practicum, and they've never received any ongoing coaching or mentoring on what to do in certain situations. Because I will add that, intervention for a child with dyslexia is a very prescriptive intervention. And so the teacher or the interventionist has to be able to know what those errors mean and be able to do error analysis and tweak the instruction accordingly. So if you are just reading a script and going through the motions, you might have the best program in the world. You might be following it exactly as it says, but the student is not getting meaningful instruction because you're missing all the errors that they're making, and you're not circling back to reteach skills to mastery. You're just moving on because now we're moving on to the next page. Check the box. Right. We did that. So it can be, it can be very different depending upon the school team and the teacher and the district.
Great. Thank you. And the parent says thank you here as well. Our next question is asking you to talk a little bit about ESY and qualifications for ESY.
Sure. So that's a hot topic right now, I will say, but I do want to start off by saying, again, I can't say it enough. I feel like I say it all the time. ESY is not limited to the summer. ESY is not summer school. So when we're talking about ESY, this is extended school year services for students who have an IEP. And ESY could happen all throughout the year. It could happen on the weekends. It could happen on holiday breaks. It can happen in the summer. So when a school team, an IEP team, is considering ESY, there are about 7 factors of consideration that they're really supposed to go through and discuss and determine, does the student meet any of these criteria? And for the parents who are with us to know, you don't have to meet all of the ESY criteria. You simply have to meet one. And the criteria that unfortunately is often talked about is only regression. So school teams will have a very quick 2-minute conversation and say, well, we don't suspect regression, or there's no evidence of regression, so we don't believe this child meets the criteria for ESY. However, some of the other criteria can be severity of disability. So if a child has a significant multi-year gap, the severity of the disability can be a factor in determining that they meet the ESY criteria and should have those services. You can also actually have a student who receives an intervention and they are making such amazing progress, and this is coming together for them. They're decoding, they're encoding or spelling skills, that we don't want to stop the instruction because we're kind of on a roll, right? And so that can be considered breakout skills or breakout abilities for the child are coming together. And many families don't know breakout skills, breakout opportunity is an ESY criteria that, if met, allows the child to have extended school year services. So that's just a couple of the criteria, but certainly families can Google in their state and look up through their Department of Education, what are the ESY criteria for my district? And I would, if I were a parent, ask the school team, the IEP team, to go through all of that criteria if you really are trying to advocate for your child to get extended school year. Because unfortunately, in my observation, it's just kind of skipped over.
And, as you're talking about that, it's reminding me of a blog that we did do in the past about COVID-19 recovery services and ESY. And I'm going to go ahead and put a link to that blog in the chat so that way you guys can reach that. And also, you'll notice that our website is going by, and I'd like to encourage you all to subscribe to our website. If you get one of our downloads under our resources tab, or just subscribe through that pop-up, you'll be receiving weekly newsletters. We call it Dyslexia Discussion, that include timely tips about ESY, transition meetings, things that are going on that you need to know. So that just comes to your inbox once a week, and we'd love to get in touch with you.
Yeah.
What types of data should parents ask schools to collect to inform an ESY decision? I love these questions.
Yeah, I know. So definitely, when you're talking about ESY, you're talking about the child's progress. So I would, at a minimum, a school district is supposed to be providing the parent with an IEP progress report at least once a quarter. So we're in the third quarter right now. So parents should have at least 2 progress reports for each of their child's goals. In addition to that, many school districts did testing at the beginning of the school year. They, it depends on the district, but there's usually some type of grade level assessment by skill, typically in reading and math, because those are the core instructional areas that many school districts are nervous about and are following closely. So often we will see those assessments are given in the fall, and then they're given in the winter, and then they're given in the spring. If your child is in a district that gives those benchmark assessments, I would want all of that information. They most likely have, as part of working on your child through the IEP, their IEP goals, while the progress report might just be limited to a general, yes, they're making sufficient progress, or yes, they're making some progress. You can ask for all of that detailed data that went into, how did you determine that my child's a 3 and making sufficient progress? I would like to see, all of the writing samples or the spelling list, or do you have a copy of that? If the parent's really concerned and is not really, I hate to say it, but trusting. Sometimes parents aren't trusting that the intervention is happening the way that it's supposed to. So you're really looking for any and all assessment data, progress monitoring data as it relates to your child's IEP goals, because that's what they're going to be talking about as part of the ESY discussion. Did this child make some progress that we believe is at risk if we go through the summer and we stop the intervention? And as I said earlier, it could be from a concern about regression, or it could be, they made so much progress that if we stop this instruction, because we know, again, that the intervention that works for kids with dyslexia has to be repetitive, has to be intensive. It's usually 4 to 5 times a week. You can't necessarily take 3 months off and expect that the child's going to stay at that level. So it really depends. What do you, again, I hate to keep saying, what are we trying to accomplish through the ESY discussion? But if that's what you're asking for, you need to have data that supports that request. And we talk a lot about this in our group parent coaching class on advocacy, is when parents go to the table, we spend 2 days teaching on data and interpretation of data and using data to back up your parent request. Because as parents, if we just show up to the table and say, we believe, we want, we think, we feel, it's pretty easy for school districts to say, well, we disagree. But if you bring to them and you request in advance the data that substantiates your position or your rationale, now it is much more difficult for the school district to simply refuse your request.
Great point. How can parents support teachers that might want to dive into science of reading, but the school system is not implementing science of reading in the foreseeable future?
That's another great question. Well, I will say that some exciting, I don't know where this parent lives. I hope they live in Virginia, because we just had some exciting legislation pass this last session, which was Delegate Coiner's bill, which is all based on a statewide literacy overhaul, is what I'm going to call it. I've been waiting 11 years for this bill to pass in one form or another. And it is going to revamp how we assess reading, identify reading difficulties, the intervention, how we train our teachers. It's all based on science of reading. But as I like to say, that might be for the grandkids, right? Because I think the implementation date is 23-24 annual year. But for this parent, I would say she's wanting to have the school district do additional teacher training on science of reading. I would absolutely start talking with school board members I would be making public comment at school board sessions. I would, if you have a special education advisory committee in your school district, I would be going to those meetings, making public comment, asking questions about how we're training our teachers, how are we giving them the right tools so that they can reach all of their students. And we know that if up to 1 in 5 kids can have dyslexia, are our teachers really being adequately prepared to meet their needs?
And Lorraine, she shared that she's actually from Loudoun County Public Schools right here in Virginia. And she added first grade teacher. The elementary school where she teaches is in the second wave of SOR in LCPS. So it's not supposed to be implemented for her until 23-24.
Yeah, but so to me, this is a blessing and something we've been waiting a long time for. But there's other avenues too, like the Virginia Department of Education, going back 4 years, had pilot programs that teachers could apply for and attend that were on Orton Gillingham instruction. So, I will say on a positive note, as a state, we've done a lot of change, and I've been pleased to be a part of passing all of this legislation where we have revamped the higher education requirement for reading specialists. So now the curriculum is based on the science of reading. So we're trying to, I know many advocates, many parents who are passionate about this issue, we're trying to come at it from multiple angles. So before we even put a reading teacher in the school district, we want them to have the appropriate training. Those teachers that are already in a school district, the Virginia Department of Education offers training. PTSI, the Parent Education Advocacy Training, the PTI centers across the country, Parent Training Information Centers sometimes have teacher training programs. There are independent groups like ASDAC, which is the Atlantic Seaboard for Dyslexia. Let me get it right. Education Association, I think. But yeah, I think that, and then there's folks that offer scholarships for teacher training. So it really is talking about it to start with, asking for it, educating maybe your school board members, your school officials like assistant superintendents, and even the superintendent. I think parents should feel comfortable to write a letter to the superintendent and say, this school district had this problem. They put this in place. They train their teachers. This is what's happening now. How can we ensure that those actions are happening in our school district? Or inform them of the recently passed legislation and ask them, what are we doing as a school district to get ready for this implementation? How are we training our teachers now? And can I, as a parent, help point you in the right direction to the right resources that you might need so that we're getting our teachers prepared to meet the needs of our students?
Excellent. Excellent. And so, Lorraine, where did you do your training? Can you tell us a little bit about, we have such informed parents here. If they wanted to dive deeper into this, where should they go to learn more about dyslexia?
Well,
and special education advocacy.
Okay, well, and that's a little bit different, right? One is training on dyslexia, the other's on advocacy. And I will just say that obviously this sounds kind of flippant, but it's true. I've been doing training for over 11 years because I'm also the parent of a severely dyslexic child. So I learned firsthand as a parent, and then through that experience, I did seek out, multiple training opportunities. Some of the best training that I received was through COPA, the Council of Parent Advocates and Attorneys, as well as the William and Mary Law School does special education advocacy training. There's PTSI, the Parent Education Advocacy Training Center does training. And in the area of dyslexia, I have worked with Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley at the Dyslexia Training Institute in San Diego. But there's just Pete Wright of Wright's Law does wonderful programs for parents that are like half day and full day. And I'm going to plug our own program too, Melissa, because I want to say that the reason I created the Dyslexia Advocacy Advantage, which is a 6-week course, is because I wanted to help fast track parents who have kids with dyslexia learn all that they needed to know and give them a framework to use to advocate for these kids year after year after year. In most cases, parents don't have the resources to hire an advocate or an attorney and have them at every school meeting. And I understand that. And we feel their pain because they show up at events like this, or they email us, or they come to discovery calls. So it's really from a desire to serve all families that we have this group coaching program. And I think, if you're interested in conversations like these, learning my framework, learning how to do this, we have a course starting in late April. But in addition to what we do, which is very specific for advocating for kids with dyslexia, as I said, Pete Wright, Parent Education Advocacy Training Centers like PTSI in Virginia or PTIs across the state, COPA, IDA even does training. I love some of the programs that the International Dyslexia Association does, and the Virginia branch of IDA. I'm on their board of directors, Virginia branch IDA, so it's VBIDA. They have wonderful programs on, teaching reading instruction and morphology and encoding and multisensory math. So, I am a huge proponent of continuing education. So I continue to learn advocacy as well as, specific content. But yeah, if people want more about that, they can reach out to us and we'll point them in the right direction.
Yep. I did add our website down below for DAA, Dyslexia Advocacy Advantage. So that way people can go directly there if they're interested. Now, I know our time is almost up.
Yes.
I could ask you one more question, Lorraine.
Yep.
We have here a question that says 9th grader with mild ID, reading at a 3rd to 4th grade level, 9th grader, finally given the YAT-4, scored poorly overall. Would this indicate dyslexia? Till now, ID tag was used to justify the poor reading abilities, but I hear now they say that all children can be taught to read, irrespective of their IQ.
Yes. So first of all, I don't know what mild ID actually means, but I'm going to take that as though the child does meet the criteria from an IQ standpoint to have the designation of intellectual disability. That said, absolutely, while they may not have dyslexia, the dyslexia intervention, approach, and methodology is absolutely possible in teaching that child how to learn to read and spell. Because what the research has shown us is that not only is it effective for students with dyslexia, it's effective for, as this parent is saying, students with mild ID, students who have autism, students who are English language learners. This approach, I'm going to use the structured literacy approach that is multisensory and done with fidelity the way it's intended. It meets the needs of all kids. And that's why, we're so excited to see what's happening in Virginia, hopefully changing in general, how we teach reading in grades K through 3 is critical to meeting everyone's needs. So I would say to that parent, absolutely, that is a viable option in helping your child learn how to read and spell. And it may actually be the most effective because it is multisensory and is not just rote memorization. I know we're out of time, so I don't want to start talking about whole language and balanced literacy approaches, but those are definitely not effective for a good portion of the population.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lorraine. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. It has been a pleasure talking with you guys today. If you have any other questions for us, or you want to talk to Lorraine about your personal situation, you have questions about the group coaching program, anything, reach out to us at LorraineHightower.com. You'll see a little red button right on the top right. You just click that and book your discovery call. And we would love to speak with you. So thank you guys again.
Yeah, and thank you for the great questions. This has been so fun for me, and I enjoy it so much, and we hope that this was beneficial for you. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye, guys.